They came slowly. The poets tell us that men charge into battle, welcoming the slaughter as eagerly as any lover, but a shield wall is a fearsome thing. The men of Wessex knew they would not break us with a wild charge, but would only reach the gate behind us by keeping their ranks tight and their shields overlapped and firm. And so they walked to us, their faces watchful and grim above the iron rims of their stag-painted shields. Every third man carried a shortened spear, the others came with either a seax or an axe. I had left Wasp Sting in Wayman's belly, and I needed her. A long sword is no weapon for a shield wall, but Serpent Breath was in my hand, and she would have to serve. "Our king is coming!" I shouted. "Hold them!" "Kill them!" Elfweird's high-pitched voice screamed. "Slaughter them!" The West Saxon spears were lowered. I had thought their rear ranks might throw spears, but none came, though Whitker's men hurled spears over our heads. The blades thumped into West Saxon shields. "Break them!" Athelhelm shouted, and they came forward, still cautiously, men stepping around Wayman's massive corpse. Their shields made a constant clatter, edge touching edge. They were close now, so close. They stared into our eyes. We stared into theirs. Men took a breath, steeling themselves for the clash of shields. Harsh voices were ordering them onwards. "Kill them!" Elfweird shouted excitedly. He had drawn a sword, but was staying well back from the fight. "For God, and for the king!" a West Saxon shouted. And then they came. They screamed. They shouted, they charged the last 2 paces, and our shields met with a thunder of clashing wood. My shield was pressed back. I heaved. An axe hacked at the rim, narrowly missing my face. A warrior with gritted teeth and a badly mended helmet was grimacing at me just inches from my face. He was trying to thread a seax past my shield's edge as the axeman attempted to pull my shield down, but the axe's blade slipped from the rent it had made, and I heaved again, pushing the grimacing man back, and Finnan must have lunged his seax into him, because he sank down, giving me space enough to lunge Serpent Breath at the axeman. Men were shouting. Blades were clashing. Priests were calling on their god to kill us. A Mercian spearman behind me thrust past my shield. I heard Athelhelm's voice, touched with panic, yelling at his men that they must close the gate. I looked up when he shouted and caught his eye an instant. "Close the gate!" His voice was shrill. I looked away from him as an axe thumped on my shield. I shook the blade off as a Mercian spearman thrust a spear past me. I rammed Serpent Breath forward, felt her strike wood and lunged again, but my elbow was jarred by Rumwald, who had staggered against me. He was whimpering. Then his shield fell and he sank down. The spearman behind me tried to take his place, but Rumwald was thrashing wildly, suddenly screaming in agony, and so stopped him. A West Saxon spear pierced Rumwald's mail. Then a merciful axe split his helmet, shattered his skull. The spearman lunged at Rumwald's killer, but a West Saxon seized the ash shaft and tugged until Serpent Breath skewered his armpit. "Kill them!" Elfweird screeched. "Kill them! Kill them! Kill them all!" "You must close the gate!" Athelhelm bellowed. "God is with us!" Father Oda's voice was hoarse. The men in our rear rank were shouting, encouraging us to kill. Wounded men moaned, the dying screamed. The battle stench of blood and shit filled my nostrils. "Hold them!" I bellowed. A spear or a seax scored across my left thigh. Finnan lunged. The spearman from the second rank had stepped across Rumwald's body and his shield touched mine. He lasted maybe long enough to lunge his spear once, then the axe drove into his shoulder, opening him deep, and he fell beside his lord. And the axeman, a fair-haired man with a blood-spattered beard, swung his blade at me, and I raised the shield to block the blow, saw the wood split where the blade struck, swung the shield down, and drove Serpent Breath at his eyes. He jerked away. Another man had taken the dying Mercian's place, and he stabbed with a shortened spear, driving the blade into the axeman's groin. The axe dropped, The man shrieked in agony and, like Waymond, fell to his knees. There were dead and dying men between us and the enemy, who had to step on the bodies to reach us and try to stab and lunge and hack their way to the gate. The drums still pounded. Shields were splintering. The West Saxons were driving us back by weight of numbers. Then there was a bellow behind me, a cheer, a clatter of hooves, and something slammed into my back, throwing me to my knees, and I looked up to see a horseman thrusting a long spear over my head. More horsemen came. The Mercian cheers grew. I managed to stand. Finan had thrown down his seax and drawn Soul Stealer, because the horsemen were driving the West Saxons back, giving us space for longer blades. "Break them!" another voice shouted, and I had a glimpse of Ethelstan, his helmet a glory of polished steel circled with gold, thrusting his stallion into the West Saxon ranks. The warrior king had come, glorious in gold, ruthless in steel, and he hacked with a longsword, beating down his enemies. His men spurred to join him, spears stabbing, and suddenly the enemy broke. They just broke. The longer spears of the Mercian horsemen had reached deep into the West Saxon ranks, and on another day, on another battlefield, that would not have mattered. Horses are easy to wound, and a panicked horse is no help to his rider. But on that day, by the Gate of Cripples, the horsemen came with a savage fury, led by a king who wanted to fight and who led his men from the front. There was blood on his stallion's chest, but the horse kept plunging, rearing, flailing with heavy hooves, and Ethelstan kept shouting his men onwards. His long sword reddened, and our shield wall, saved from death, found new passion. Our line, so short and so vulnerable, now surged forward. Breitwulf had returned and joined the charge, bellowing at his men to follow. Then Ethelstan's horsemen split the enemy's shield wall, and the West Saxons broke in panic. Because a king had come, and a king now fled. "Sweet Jesus," Finan said. We were sitting on the lowest step of the stairs leading to the ramparts that were rapidly emptying of the enemy. I lifted off my helmet and dropped it on the ground. "It's so damned hot," I said. "Summer," Finan said bleakly. Still more of Ethelstan's men were streaming through the gate. The East Anglians who had first threatened us had dropped their shields and seemed to have no interest in what happened in the city. A few had wandered back to the gate in search of ale, and they took no notice of us, and we took no notice of them. Immer had brought me wasp sting. She lay on the ground in front of me, waiting for a blade to be cleaned, while Serpent Breath lay on my knees, and I kept touching her blade, scarce able to believe I'd found her again. "You gutted that bastard," Finan said, nodding towards Wayerman's corpse. There were perhaps 40 or 50 other corpses left from Athelhelm's shield wall. The wounded had been helped into the shade where they groaned. "He was fast," I said, "but he was clumsy. I didn't expect that. I thought he was better. Big bastard, though." "Big bastard," I agreed. I looked down at my left thigh. The bleeding had stopped. The wound was shallow, and I started laughing. "What's funny?" Finan asked. "I swore an oath." "You always were an idiot." I nodded agreement. "I swore to kill Athelhelm and Elfweird, and I didn't." "You tried." "I tried to keep the oath," I said. "They're probably dead by now," Finan said. "And they wouldn't be dead if you hadn't taken the gate, so yes, you kept your oath. And if they're not dead, they soon will be." I stared across the city where the killing continued. "It would be nice to kill them both, though," I said wistfully. "For Christ's sake, you've done enough." "We've done enough," I corrected him. Ethelstan and his men were hunting through the streets and alleys of London, seeking out Athelhelm, Elfweird and their supporters, and those supporters were few. The East Anglians did not want to fight for them, and many of the West Saxons simply threw down their shields and weapons. Athelhelm's vaunted army, as large an army as had been seen in Britain for many a year, had proved as fragile as an eggshell. Ethelstan was king. And that evening, as the smoke above London glowed red in the light of the sinking sun, the king sent for me. He was king of Wessex now, king of East Anglia, and king of Mercia. "It is all one country," he told me that night. We were in the great hall of London's palace, originally built for the kings of Mercia, then occupied by Alfred of Wessex, then by his son Edward of Wessex, and now the property of Ethelstan. But Ethelstan of what? Of England? I looked into his dark, clever eyes, so like the eyes of his grandfather Alfred, and knew he was thinking of the fourth Saxon kingdom, Northumbria. "You swore an oath, Lord King," I reminded him. "I did indeed," he said, not looking at me, but gazing down the hall where the leaders of his warriors were gathered at two long tables. Finan was there with Breitwulf, as were Witgar and Mirhwala, all drinking ale or wine because this was a feast, a celebration, and the victors were eating the food that had belonged to the defeated. Some of the defeated West Saxons were there too, those who had surrendered quickly and sworn allegiance to their conqueror. Most men still wore their mail, though Ethelstan had stripped off his own armour and wore a costly black coat beneath a short cloak dyed a deep and rich blue. The cloak's hems were embroidered with gold thread. He had a gold chain about his neck from which hung a golden cross, and about his head was a simple gold circlet. He was no longer the boy I had protected through the long years when his enemies had tried to destroy him. Now he had the stern face of a warrior king. He looked like a king too. He was tall, straight-backed and handsome, but that was not why his enemies had called him Fea Knapper. They had used that derisive name because Ethelstan had let his dark hair grow long and then twisted it into a dozen ringlets that were threaded with gold wires. Before the feast, when I had been summoned to share the high table, he had seen me staring at the glittering strands beneath the gold circlet, and he had given me a defiant look. "A king," he said defensively, "must appear kingly." "He must indeed, Lord King," I had said. He had looked at me with those clever eyes, judging whether I mocked him, but before he could say more, I had dropped to one knee. "I take pleasure at your victory, Lord King," I had said humbly. "As I am grateful for all you did," he had said, then raised me up and insisted that I should sit at his right hand where, gazing down at the celebrating warriors, I had just reminded him of the oath he had sworn me. "I did indeed swear an oath," he said. "I swore not to invade Northumbria while you live." He paused and reached for a silver jug that was etched with Athelhelm's stag. "And you can be sure," he went on, "that I am mindful of that oath." His voice was guarded, and still he looked into the hall, but then he turned to me and smiled. "And I thank God that you do live, Lord Uhtred." He poured me wine from the jug. "I am told you rescued Queen Eadgifu." "I did, Lord King." I still found it strange to address him as I had addressed his grandfather. "So far as I know, she's safe at Bebbanburg." "That was well done," he said. "You can send her to Kent and assure her of our protection." "And for her sons, too?" "Of course." He sounded annoyed that I had even asked. "They are my nephews." He sipped wine, his eyes brooding on the tables below us. "And I hear you hold Ethelwulf as a prisoner." "I do, Lord King." "You will send him to me, and release the priest." He did not wait for my assent, but simply assumed I would obey him. "What do you know of Guthfrith?" I had expected the question, because Guthfrith, brother to Sigtrygr, had taken the throne in Jofawick. Sigtrygr had died of the plague, and that was almost all the news Ethelstan knew of the north. He had heard that the sickness had ended, and he had ordered the roads to Jofawick to be opened again, but of Bebbanburg he could tell me nothing. Nor did he know the fate of his sister, Sigtryg's queen, nor of my grandchildren. "All I know, Lord King," I answered him carefully, "is that Sigtrygr wasn't fond of his brother. He's a Norseman, of course, and a pagan," he said, glancing at the silver hammer I still wore. "And some pagans, Lord King," I said sharply, "helped keep the Kreppelgate open for you." He just nodded at that, poured the last of the wine into his goblet, then stood and hammered the empty jug on the table to silence the hall. He hammered it at least a dozen times before the noise subsided and the warriors were all looking at him. He raised his goblet. "I have to thank the Lord Uhtred," he turned and inclined his head to me, "who this day gave us London." The warriors cheered, and I had wanted to remind the king that Britwulf had helped, and poor Rumwald had died helping, and so many good men had fought at the Kreppelgate, where they had expected to die for him, and some had. But before I could say anything, Ethelstan turned to Father Oda, who sat on his left. I knew he was inviting the Danish priest to serve in his household, an invitation I knew Oda would accept. Athelhelm was dead. He had been caught trying to escape through one of the western gates, and Mirwalla, who had joined Ethelstan's army, had been one of the men who pierced him with a spear. Elfweird had become separated from his uncle, and with just 4 men tried to escape across London's bridge, only to find the fort at the southern end barred to him by the handful of men we had left there. He had begged them to let him pass, had offered them gold, which they accepted, but when he rode through the opened gate, they had hauled him from his horse and taken both his gold and his crown. His 4 men had just watched. Now, after the feast, when men were singing and a harpist playing, Elfweird was brought to Ethelstan. Candles lit the hall, the shadows thrown by their flickering flames leaping about the high rafters. The boy, he was 20 years old, but he looked 6 or 7 years younger, was escorted by 2 warriors. He looked terrified, his moon face crumpled by crying. He no longer wore his fine mail, but was dressed in a grubby shift that hung to his knees. He was pushed up the stairs of the high table's dais, and the harpist stopped playing. The singing died, and Ethelstan stood and walked to the front of the table so that every man in the now silent hall could see this meeting of the half-brothers. One was so tall and commanding, the other looked so pathetic as he dropped to his knees. One of the 2 men guarding Elfweird was holding the crown the boy had worn in the battle, and Ethelstan now held out his hand and took it. He turned it in his hands, so that the emeralds flashed in the candlelight. Then he held it out to Elfweird. "Wear it," he told his half-brother, "and stand." Elfweird looked up but said nothing. His hands were shaking. Ethelstan smiled. "Come, brother," he said, and held out his left hand to help Elfweird to his feet, then gave him the crown. "Wear it proudly. It was our father's gift to you." Elfweird had looked astonished, but now, grinning because he believed he would be king of Wessex still, albeit in submission to Ethelstan, he put the crown on his head. "I will be loyal," he promised his half-brother. "Of course you will," Ethelstan said gently. He looked at one of the guards. "Your sword?" he commanded, and when he had the long blade in his hand, he pointed it at Elfweird. "Now you will swear an oath to me," he said. "Gladly," Elfweird bleated. "Touch the sword, brother," Ethelstan said, still gently, and when Elfweird put a tentative hand on the blade, Ethelstan just lunged. One straight, savage lunge that shattered his half-brother's ribcage, drove him back with Ethelstan following, and then the sword pierced Elfweird's heart. Some men gasped. A serving girl screamed. Father Oda made the sign of the cross. But Ethelstan just watched his brother die. "Take him to Wintoncester," he said when the last blood had pulsed and the last twitch ended. He tugged the blade free. "Bury him beside his father." The emerald-encrusted crown had rolled under the table where it struck my ankle. I retrieved it and held it for a few heartbeats. This was the crown of Wessex, Alfred's crown, and I remember the dying king telling me it was a crown of thorns. I placed it on the linen cloth that covered the board and looked at Ethelstan. "Your crown, Lord King." "Not until Archbishop Athelm consecrates me," Ethelstan said. The Archbishop, who'd been held in the palace as a privileged prisoner, sat at the high table. He looked confused, his hands shaking as he ate and drank, but he nodded at Ethelstan's words. "And you will come to the ceremony, Lord Uhtred?" Ethelstan demanded, meaning that I should attend the solemn moment when the Archbishop of Contwaraberg placed the royal helmet of Wessex on the new king's head. "With your permission, Lord King," I said, "I would go home." He hesitated a moment, then nodded abruptly. "You have my permission," he said. I was going home. In time we heard that Ethelstan was crowned. The ceremony was performed at Kynningston on the Thames, where his father had been given the royal helmet of Wessex, but Ethelstan refused the helmet, instead insisting that the Archbishop place the emerald crown on his gold-threaded hair. The Ealdorman of 3 Kingdoms acclaimed the moment, and Alfred's dream of one Christian kingdom thus came one step nearer. And now I sat on Bebbanburg's high rock, the flame-lit hall behind me and the moon-silvered sea before me, and I thought of the dead, of Folkbold, killed by a spear thrust in the shield wall by the Kreppelgate, of Sigtrygr, felled by fever and dying in his bed with a sword in his hand, of his 2 children, my grandchildren, both dead, of Edith, who had gone to Jofawick to care for the children and had caught their plague and was now buried. "Why did she go?" I had asked my son. "She thought you would want her to go." I had said nothing, just felt guilt. The plague had not reached as far north as Bebbanburg. My son had barred the roads, threatening travellers with death if they tried to come onto our land, and so the sickness had ravaged the land from Lincoln to Jofawick, and then spread through the great vale of farms that surrounded the city, but it had been kept from Bebbanburg. The plague had died itself by the time we reached Jofawick on our journey north. And Guthfrith was king there, his election supported by the Danish Jarls who still ruled much of Northumbria. I had met him briefly. Like his brother Sigtrygr, he was a thin, fair-haired man with a handsome face, but unlike Sigtrygr, he was sour and suspicious. The night I met him, when he reluctantly feasted me in his great hall, he had demanded my allegiance, had demanded that I swear an oath to him, but he had not demanded it instantly, suggesting that when the feast was over, there would be time enough for that brief ceremony. Then he had drunk mead and ale, had demanded more mead, then cheered raucously when one of his men bent a serving girl over the table. "Bring her here," he shouted. "Bring the bitch here!" But by the time the girl had been dragged to the platform where we ate, Guthfrith was vomiting into the rushes and he slept soon after. We left in the morning, mounted on horses taken from Athelhelm's beaten army, and I had sworn no oath. I had ridden home with my men, with Finan, an Irishman, with Gebrut, a Frisian, with Immer, a Dane, with Vidar, a Norseman, and with Beanoth and Oswy, both Saxons. We were 7 warriors, but we were brothers too, and with us rode the children we had rescued in London, a dozen of the slaves we had freed from Gunnold's ship, and Benedetta. And Edith was dead, and I was home at last, where the sea wind swept across the rock and where I thought of the dead, where I thought of the future, and where I thought of the 3 kingdoms that were now one and wanted a 4th. Benedetta sat beside me. Elena, as ever, was near her. The child crouched, watching as Benedetta took my hand. I gripped hers, maybe too hard, yet she did not complain or take it away. "You did not want her dead," she said. "But I did," I spoke softly and bleakly. "Then God will forgive you," she said, and leaned her head on my shoulder. "He made us," she added, "so he must take us as we are. That is his fate." I had come home.
Afterward by Bernard.